The night
はい。
air in Pittsburgh was heavy with the metallic scent of rain and blood. Red and blue lights pulsed against the cracked brick walls of a quiet suburban street, painting the darkness in violent flashes. Detective Thomas Tom Callahan stepped out of his unmarked car, the weight of his badge colder than usual against his chest. He had seen death before, many times, but nothing prepared him for what waited inside the Keaton residence. The front door hung crooked on its hinges, kicked in with brutal force. Shards of glass glittered across the hallway floor like frozen tears. A framed photo of the Keaton family, Andrew, Laura, their 2 children, lay shattered near the entryway, the smiling faces now splintered and distorted. And in the living room, under the dull glow of a fallen lamp, the scene turned from tragedy to nightmare. Andrew Keaton, a respected contractor in the city, lay sprawled on the carpet, blood seeping into the fibers beneath him. Laura's body was found near the stairs, one arm outstretched as if she had tried to reach for help that never came. Their teenage son, Michael, was slumped beside the coffee table, his eyes still open, wide with terror. All 3 were gone, but there was one more. Tom followed the quiet, trembling sound that didn't belong, so faint it might have been the wind or a broken pipe. In the master bedroom, he knelt and lifted the bed skirt, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. There, curled into a ball beneath the bed, was a little girl. Her dress was soaked in someone else's blood. Her eyes were vacant, her lips trembling but silent. "Sophie," Tom whispered, recognizing her from the photo. "It's okay. You're safe now." But she didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't speak a word. At just 5 years old, Sophie Keaton had survived what no child should ever see. And in the weeks that followed, Tom realized survival was only the beginning of her suffering. The investigation was relentless. Evidence was scarce, motives tangled. There were signs of forced entry, but nothing stolen. Andrew had no known enemies, at least none on paper. Forensics scraped fingerprints from every surface, ran DNA tests, traced phone calls. Nothing matched. Leads dried up one by one until the case, like so many others, was quietly shelved as unsolved. Tom hated that word. It echoed in his mind every time he saw Sophie sitting in the sterile waiting room of Child Protective Services, small legs dangling from a chair too big for her, staring blankly at the wall. She hadn't spoken a single word since that night. Not to the doctors, not to the social workers, not even to Tom. It was as if the horror had stolen her voice, along with her family. "No relatives?" he asked one afternoon. The caseworker shook her head. "No one's come forward. She'll go into foster care." Tom stared at Sophie through the glass. She was tracing invisible shapes on the armrest with her finger, lost somewhere far away. He'd been doing this job long enough to know what the system could do to a child like her. How easily she could disappear into a cycle of homes, diagnoses, and silence. He also knew the guilt that gnawed at him wouldn't let him walk away. He had failed to catch the monster who destroyed her life, but maybe he could still protect what was left of it. "I'll take her," he heard himself say. "I'll apply for guardianship." The process wasn't easy, but a few weeks later, Sophie moved into Tom's small townhouse on the edge of the city. At first, she floated through the rooms like a ghost, clutching a stuffed rabbit salvaged from the Keaton house. She communicated only with nods and shrugs, or scribbled words on scraps of paper when she had to. Tom, newly divorced and used to silence himself, found their quiet strangely bearable. Over time, he learned her rhythms, the way she preferred the lights dimmed at night, how she froze at the sound of breaking glass, the way she watched the rain with an intensity that seemed to pull her somewhere else. 10 years passed. Sophie grew from a fragile, terrified child into a reserved but intelligent teenager. She still didn't speak, But her eyes carried entire conversations. She still scribbled notes instead of words. But Tom understood her better than anyone else in the world. And every night, after she went to bed, he sat at the kitchen table with the cold case file spread before him. Photos, reports, diagrams, the same unanswered questions he had stared at for a decade. Who could commit something so savage? Why leave a single witness alive? Somewhere out there, a killer still breathed the same air, walked the same streets. And Tom Callahan, now more father than detective, swore he would not let that monster remain a ghost forever. The rain had just begun to fall, soft and steady, tracing silver lines down the kitchen window when Tom placed the box on the table. It was simple, wooden, worn at the corners, filled with brushes, pencils, and paints in every color. For you, he said, sliding it toward Sophie. She was 15 now, her hair longer, her silence deeper. She glanced at the box briefly, then back the book she was reading, offering nothing more than a slight nod. Weeks passed, and the gift gathered dust in the corner of her room, untouched. Tom tried not to be disappointed. He told himself healing couldn't be rushed. Maybe one day she would reach for it when she was ready. It was on a gray afternoon in late October that he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound from behind Sophie's closed bedroom door. A soft scratch, like a whisper against paper. He hesitated outside, then knocked gently. No answer. Slowly, he pushed the door open. Sophie was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a sheet of paper in front of her, brush in hand. For the first time in 10 years, she was painting. Tom stood there, afraid even the sound of his breath might break the fragile moment. The paper was a storm of motion. Spirals twisting into each other, jagged lines colliding, splashes of dark color bleeding into gray. There was no shape, no clear image, only chaos. Yet in that chaos, he saw something else too. Pain. Pure, unfiltered pain that had lived inside her for a decade, finally given form. When she noticed him watching, Sophie froze, brush hovering midair, but Tom only smiled softly. "It's beautiful," he said. She didn't respond, but she didn't stop either. And that was enough. Over the next few weeks, the paintings multiplied. Every evening after school, Sophie shut herself in her room and filled page after page. Tom never intruded. Sometimes he'd find discarded sketches in the trash, sheets covered in frantic swirls, heavy black strokes, or trembling red circles that reminded him of lose. But then one night, as he gathered the scattered pages to stack them neatly, something caught his eye. It was subtle, so subtle he almost missed it. Among the wild lines and splatters, a small, curved shape appeared again and again, not identical, but unmistakably consistent. Always the same arc, always in the same place, woven into the storm as if it were part of the chaos, yet apart from it. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. The next morning, Tom carried a few of the sketches to a diner on Liberty Avenue where he was meeting Patrick Doyle, his old partner from the force and one of the few people he still trusted. Patrick slid into the booth opposite him, raising an eyebrow at the stack of papers. "From Sophie," Tom said. "She's been painting again." Patrick flipped through them, his expression unreadable. "Looks like teenage angst to me," he muttered. "Tom, maybe it's time to stop digging. It's been 10 years. The case is dead. Sophie deserves a life that's not defined by what happened." Tom bristled. "You think this is about me? She's expressing something. Look closer." Patrick sighed, setting the pages down. "I don't see anything worth chasing. Don't go down this rabbit hole again." But Tom couldn't unsee it. That curve gnawed at him. It wasn't just a shape. It reminded him of something familiar, something buried deep in the case file he still opened every night. It was like a scar he had seen before. Driving home, the sketches lay beside him on the passenger seat, the ink still fresh. The rain drummed harder against the windshield as his mind raced back to the photos, the autopsy report, the evidence bag sealed and forgotten. For the first time in years, Tom felt something stir beneath the heavy weight of failure. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't even hope. It was smaller, quieter, like the faint glow of a match in a long dark room. Maybe Sophie wasn't just painting her pain. Maybe, without realizing it, she was painting the truth. The sketches changed. What had once been storms of shapeless chaos began to take form, hesitant but deliberate. Sophie's brushstrokes grew steadier, her lines more defined. Shapes emerged from the swirls. Shapes that carried stories Tom could feel, but not yet understand. One painting stopped him cold. A house, its walls painted in shades of black, so deep they seemed to swallow the paper. Around it, twisted branches clawed at a gray sky, barren and skeletal. And looming over it all was a shape, amorphous, shifting, darker than anything else. A shadow without a face. It wasn't part of the house nor of the trees. It was separate, watching, surrounding, consuming. Tom stared at it for a long time that night. The house lit only by the faint glow from the kitchen lamp. Something inside him twisted. He wasn't just looking at a painting. He was looking at Sophie's mind. He needed help understanding what it was trying to say. The next morning, Tom scheduled an appointment with Dr. Evelyn Harper, a child psychologist known for her work with trauma survivors. Her office was warm, lined with soft lighting and shelves of books and toys meant to make children feel safe. Sophie sat in silence during the first session, sketching quietly in her lap while Evelyn spoke gently about nothing in particular. Her favorite colors, the weather, the art supplies she liked best. By the third visit, Sophie had begun to hand Evelyn her drawings without being asked. Evelyn studied them with the same seriousness Tom had. The shadow, she said finally, tapping the largest smear of darkness on one page. It's significant. In trauma survivors, especially children, recurring images like this often represent the thing they fear most. It's not just a memory. It's how their mind personifies what hurt them. Tom frowned. You think that's the killer? Evelyn nodded slowly, or rather, her mind's version of them. This shadow isn't random. It's watching her, surrounding her, threatening to erase her. That tells me Sophie doesn't just remember something. She believes it's still out there. The words hit Tom like a blow. Wants to erase her. He had spent years telling himself Sophie was lucky to be alive. But if Evelyn was right, Sophie didn't see herself as lucky. She saw herself as unfinished business. The more sessions Sophie had, the more her drawings evolved. The house remained, as did the barren trees, but the shadow grew larger, bolder. It stretched its form closer to the house, its edges bleeding into every corner of the paper. And in one session, Sophie scrawled a sentence beneath it in uneven letters. It's coming back. Tom felt a chill crawl up his spine when Evelyn showed him the page. This isn't just fear, she said quietly. This is belief. Somewhere deep inside, Sophie thinks she's still a target. From that day on, Tom threw himself into building a fortress around her. He installed new locks and reinforced the windows. He adjusted his work schedule so he could drive her to and from school himself. He walked her to the door when she met friends, checked every corner of the house before he went to bed. He wanted her to see, in every small way, that she was safe. But the drawings didn't stop. The shadow kept growing, looming larger in every piece until it seemed ready to devour the page. It didn't matter how many locks he changed or how carefully he watched. Something inside Sophie was still screaming that the darkness was near. Patrick Doyle noticed the changes too. When Tom showed him one of the newer drawings over coffee, Patrick scoffed and shook his head. You're feeding this obsession, he said. Therapy? Art? Interpretation? Tom, she's stuck because you keep dragging her back. Maybe what she needs is a clean slate. Tom narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? I mean a facility, Patrick replied. Somewhere structured, a residential treatment center, professionals who can reset her mind instead of encouraging her to live in the past. The suggestion sat wrong with Tom, heavy and sour. Patrick's words had always carried weight. After all, he was the closest thing Tom had to a brother. But this time, something in his tone scratched at the back of Tom's mind. A facility meant losing daily contact with Sophie, losing the fragile trust they had built. It meant handing her over to strangers. I'll think about it, Tom lied, folding the paper and slipping it back into his jacket. But as he drove home that night, Patrick's words echoed louder than he wanted them to. And for the first time since the investigation had gone cold, Tom felt a flicker of unease he couldn't explain. It was subtle, buried deep beneath the guilt and the worry, but it was there all the same. A whisper that maybe, just maybe, the darkness Sophie painted wasn't only living in her mind. It was Evelyn who first suggested that Tom join Sophie in her drawings. Art is a language, she told him after one of their sessions. Right now, Sophie's the only one speaking. But if you draw with her, you're telling her she's not alone inside that darkness. You're sharing the weight. Tom wasn't sure he had anything worth putting on paper, but one evening he set up 2 sheets side by side on the dining table. Sophie watched silently from across the table, her pencil hovering uncertainly over the page. I'm not very good at this, Tom admitted, uncapping a black marker, but maybe it doesn't have to be good. For a long while, there was only the scratch of pencil and the soft hum of rain against the windows. Tom didn't think too much about what he was drawing. He just let his hand move. When he finally stopped, he stared down at what had taken shape. A gaping void, an enormous black circle pulling everything into it. A black hole. It wasn't elegant and it wasn't subtle. It was the fear he'd carried for years. The fear of failing Sophie, the fear of never finding the person who destroyed her life. Sophie leaned forward, studying the drawing. Her eyes flicked between the black hole and Tom's face, as if trying to read what he meant. Then, without a word, she picked up a colored pencil and added something of her own. At the center of the page, just before the darkness, she drew a figure. It wasn't detailed. Just a silhouette of a man standing tall, bathed in light. And behind him, a smaller figure crouched low, safe in his shadow. The man's stance was defiant, unyielding. He was holding the darkness back. Tom stared at it, his throat tightening. Is that me? He asked softly. Sophie didn't answer, but for the first time, she looked directly into his eyes and nodded. It was the smallest gesture, but it spoke louder than any word. She saw him as her protector, and in that moment, Tom swore, again, as he had the night he found her, that he would never stop protecting her. Over the next several weeks, Patrick began showing up more often, sometimes unannounced, sometimes with an excuse as flimsy as just passing by. He brought Sophie small gifts, sketchbooks, headphones, movie tickets. He joked with her, coaxed her to smile, and even offered to take her to art exhibits across town. She needs normal things, Tom, Patrick said one afternoon as they stood in the kitchen. She's 15. She shouldn't spend her life drawing monsters in the dark. Tom folded his arms. She's processing. Evelyn says it's helping. Patrick shrugged. Maybe. But maybe it's also keeping her trapped there. A change of scenery could do her good. There was something in the way Patrick said it, too eager, too insistent, that unsettled Tom. At first, he told himself he was being paranoid. Patrick had always been good with Sophie, always supportive. But lately, his presence felt different. He lingered in the house longer than before. He asked questions about the therapy sessions, about Sophie's drawings, about what she remembered. And when Tom deflected, Patrick's easy smile didn't quite reach his eyes. One evening, Tom came home early to find Patrick and Sophie sitting together at the table, flipping through her sketches. Patrick was pointing at one of the shadow drawings, saying something in a low voice. Sophie's expression was blank, distant, the same look she wore the night Tom first found her under that bed. Patrick looked up, startled when he saw Tom in the doorway. "We were just talking," he said quickly, "about the art." Tom nodded, but the unease that had been gnawing at the edges of his mind now dug deeper. It wasn't jealousy and it wasn't mistrust, not yet. It was something quieter, harder to name, a feeling that the ground beneath his feet was shifting, almost imperceptibly, but enough to make him lose his balance. For years, Patrick had been the one person Tom could trust, without question. But as he watched him laugh with Sophie, that certainty wavered. Something about Patrick's interest in her healing felt too focused, too strategic, like he wasn't just trying to help, but trying to steer. And though Tom couldn't explain why, a voice deep inside him whispered that something wasn't right. The decision to go back into the archives came late one night, long after Sophie had gone to bed. Tom sat at the kitchen table, the cold case file open in front of him as it always was, pages yellowed at the edges from years of being handled. But this time, something felt different. Maybe it was the shadow in Sophie's latest drawing, stretching its arm toward something small and rectangular. Maybe it was the unease Patrick's visits had left behind. Either way, Tom couldn't ignore the pull any longer. The police archives were housed in the basement of an old municipal building on Grant Street. The air was heavy with dust and silence, the kind of place where forgotten stories slept. Tom slipped in with the ease of someone who had done it hundreds of times before, his badge still granting him access, even though he hadn't worked a case in years. The Keaton file sat where it always had, thick, overstuffed, and heartbreakingly incomplete. Tom spread its contents across a metal table under the harsh glow of a single fluorescent light. Photos of the crime scene, autopsy reports, evidence logs. He had memorized them all. But tonight he forced himself to see them as if for the first time. And then he noticed it. A small note in the evidence log he had skimmed 100 times but never truly read. Item 17 silver cigarette case, engraved with initials AK, found near victim's body. Tom froze. Andrew Keaton didn't smoke. He'd confirmed that years ago, no ashtrays in the house, no cigarette butts in the trash, no nicotine traces on his personal belongings. So why was there a cigarette case next to his body? And more importantly, why had no one ever questioned it? He flipped through the photos again, his pulse quickening. There it was, in one of the corner shots, a gleam of silver near Andrew's outstretched hand. He zoomed in with his phone camera. The engraving was faint but visible. AK. It could have been Andrew's, Tom thought. A gift, a keepsake, but it didn't fit. Andrew had been meticulous about appearances, almost obsessive. If he didn't smoke, he wouldn't carry a cigarette case, which meant someone else had brought it into that room, someone who wanted it there or forgot it in a hurry. The image from Sophie's drawings flashed in his mind. The shadow's arm extended, holding a small rectangular object that glimmered in the dark. At the time, he had dismissed it as a meaningless detail. Now it felt like a confession, hidden in paint. If the shadow was holding the cigarette case, and the case was left near Andrew's body, then Sophie had seen it, which meant the shadow, whoever it was, had been in her room. Not just after the murders, but after she hid. Tom's stomach turned. If the killer had been close enough to drop that case, they had been close enough to see her, close enough to kill her. But they didn't. Why? He didn't have an answer, but the question wouldn't let him sleep. At dawn, he called Patrick. "Meet me at O'Malley's." "It's important," Tom said, his voice tight. Patrick sounded groggy, but agreed. They met in a booth near the back, steam rising from untouched mugs of coffee. Tom slid the printed photo of the cigarette case across the table. "Do you remember this?" he asked. Patrick squinted. "Barely. Probably nothing. Maybe Andrew's." "He didn't smoke," Tom replied. Patrick's jaw shifted. "So what? Maybe a guest left it." Tom leaned forward. Then why was it next to his body? Patrick sighed heavily and pushed the photo back. Tom, you're chasing ghosts again. It's been 10 years. You really want to crawl back into that hole. This isn't nothing, Tom insisted. Sophie drew at Patrick. That means she saw it. Patrick went still. For a fraction of a second, so brief Tom almost missed it. Something flickered across his face. Not surprise, not curiosity. Something closer to discomfort. Then it was gone, replaced by a practiced, easy smile. You need to let this go, he said. For her sake, for yours. Don't dig up the past if you're not ready for what's buried there. Tom stared at him, unease prickling at the back of his neck. Patrick had always been calm under pressure, but this was different. This was defensive. And for the first time in 10 years, Tom felt something shift inside him. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even evidence. But as he walked back to his car, the question followed him like a shadow of its own. Why did Patrick look so uneasy about a silver cigarette case? The first sign that something was wrong came on a Tuesday morning, just after sunrise. Tom arrived at his small office, coffee in hand, ready to spend another sleepless day combing through old evidence. He reached for the folder that held Sophie's sketches, the ones he'd been studying night after night, and froze. It was gone. He tore the room apart, checking drawers, cabinets, the floor beneath his desk. Nothing. The folder, labeled, dated, and locked away only yesterday, had vanished without a trace. His heart pounded as he retraced his steps. He hadn't taken it home. Sophie hadn't touched it, and no one else had access to this office, at least no one who was supposed to. Before he could make sense of it, his phone rang. Detective Callahan. The voice on the other end was clipped official. This is internal affairs. We need you to come in immediately. 2 hours later, Tom sat under the cold fluorescent lights of an interrogation room, the familiar setting now turned against him. Across the table, a young investigator slid a printed document toward him. A formal complaint, she said. Anonymous. It alleges that you've been exploiting your adoptive daughter for investigative purposes, using her trauma to pursue an old case you were ordered to drop. Tom's hands clenched into fists. That's ridiculous. Is it? She pressed. We have reports of you showing her crime scene photos, encouraging her to remember details, even using her drawings as supposed evidence. They're her drawings. Tom shot back. They're how she communicates. I haven't forced her into anything. The investigator didn't flinch. Until we sort this out, you're suspended from all active access to department records. And one more thing. Child Protective Services has been notified. The words knocked the air from his lungs. CPS. They'll decide if you remain fit as a guardian while this is under review. Tom stumbled out of the building an hour later, the city spinning around him. It felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath his feet. How had everything turned so quickly? He had spent a decade protecting Sophie, dedicating his life to keeping her safe. And now, in a single morning, someone was trying to rip her away. 3 days later they came. 2 CPS workers and a uniformed officer stood on his porch with a stack of papers and apologetic eyes. Mr. Callahan, the woman said gently, we have a court order for emergency protective custody. Sophie will be placed in temporary care while we conduct an investigation. Sophie stood behind Tom, clutching the sleeve of his jacket. Her eyes were wide, confused. She didn't speak, but the tremor in her small hand said everything. You can't do this, Tom whispered, his voice breaking. She's my daughter. I'm sorry, the worker said, and those were the last words he heard before Sophie was let out the door, her figure disappearing into the back seat of a county car. When the house was silent again, Tom sank into the couch, the world closing in. 10 years of building trust, of stitching her broken pieces back together, and now she was gone. And whoever had orchestrated this had done it perfectly. 2 nights later, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was gravelly and familiar. Tom, it's Peter Nichols. You remember me, the old guard down at the archives. Tom's heart skipped. Peter, what is it? I thought you should know. I saw someone leaving the records room late the night before you reported that missing file. Didn't sign in, didn't belong there. He hesitated. It was Patrick Doyle. Tom gripped the phone tighter. Are you sure? As sure as I am about anything these days, Peter said. And there's more. He dropped something. Must have slipped from his coat. I found it near the door. Tom heard a rustle on the other end. Then Peter's voice again. It's a cufflink. Silver. Has the letter K engraved on it. The world seemed to tilt. A cufflink marked with A.K., Andrew Keaton's initial. A piece of evidence that had no business being anywhere near Patrick Doyle. Tom stared into the darkness of his empty living room, his pulse roaring in his ears, the evidence folder disappearing, the anonymous complaint, Sophie being taken, and now this. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It wasn't coincidence. Someone was tightening a noose around his life from the inside, and that someone was Patrick. It was just past noon when Tom's phone rang. He hadn't heard from Dr. Evelyn Harper since Sophie was taken, and his heart lurched when he saw her name on the screen. Tom, she said, her tone urgent, you need to come here. Sophie drew something today. I think you should see it. Tom didn't waste a second. He drove through the steady drizzle that hung over Pittsburgh like a gray shroud, his thoughts racing faster than the car. It had been days since CPS removed Sophie from his home, and every minute without her felt like a hollowed-out version of time. Now Evelyn's call Claude open a door he wasn't sure he was ready to step through. When he arrived at the trauma center, Evelyn met him in the hallway, holding a sketchbook pressed tightly to her chest. She's been drawing almost non-stop, Evelyn said softly. And today, something shifted. She led him to her office and laid the sketchbook on the desk. Tom's breath caught the second he saw the page. It was a black SUV, crudely drawn, but unmistakable. The lines were sharp, urgent, as if Sophie's hand had moved faster than her mind could keep up. Across the back was a license plate, blurred, incomplete, but 3 characters were clear. 77. Tom's pulse quickened. 77. It wasn't just any number. It was part of the plate number of Patrick Doyle's vehicle, the same SUV he'd driven for years. Tom had seen it parked in Patrick's driveway, had followed it down countless streets on late-night calls. The sight of those 2 numbers in Sophie's drawing hit him like a blow to the chest. She remembers something, Evelyn said, watching him carefully. Something important. Tom's hands trembled as he flipped to the next page. This time, the drawing was far more detailed. It wasn't an object, it was a face. Harsh, angry lines carved deep into the paper. A man's features distorted in rage. The most striking detail was the scar, a jagged line running diagonally across his cheek. But it wasn't Patrick. It was Andrew Keaton. Tom frowned, confused. This is her father. Yes, Evelyn said. And that scar, it wasn't in any of the photos from the crime scene, was it? No, Tom whispered. It wasn't. Which meant Sophie hadn't drawn Andrew from memory of his body. She had drawn him alive. A realization crept in slowly, like water seeping under a door. Sophie had seen this moment. She hadn't just hidden under the bed in terror. She had witnessed something. Maybe she had seen the struggle. Maybe she had watched her father fight for his life. And if Andrew had been alive when Sophie saw him, then someone had been in that room with him. Someone who had given him that scar. Tom's breath caught in his throat as puzzle pieces long scattered began snapping into place. Andrew Keaton had been involved in something illegal. Tom had suspected as much years ago. Money laundering, bribery. Patrick, his closest friend and business partner, had known about it too. But then Andrew had tried to back out, maybe even cooperate with the police. That would have put Patrick at risk. and Patrick had always been a man who knew how to protect himself. Tom closed his eyes, his mind reconstructing the nightmare Sophie must have seen. Patrick, furious and desperate, confronting Andrew. A fight breaking out. A blow, sharp, heavy, cutting across Andrew's cheek. And then the killing. Quick, ruthless. The pieces kept falling into place, each one darker than the last. Laura Keaton and her son must have walked in during or after the murder. They had seen something they shouldn't have. And Patrick, who had already gone too far, had no choice but to silence them too. And Sophie, little Sophie, hiding under the bed, had been there through it all. The killer had walked through that room. Maybe he even looked beneath the bed and thought she was dead. Too traumatized to move. Maybe he hadn't seen her at all. But for some reason, one Tom couldn't fathom, Patrick had left her alive. Tom stared at the drawing spread across Evelyn's desk. The SUV, the scar, the look of rage etched into Andrew's face. Sophie's memories weren't just trauma, they were testimony. He gripped the edge of the table as the enormity of it settled over him. Patrick Doyle, the man who had been at his side through the investigation, the man he had trusted like a brother, had slaughtered the Keaton family and lived 10 years free. Smiling across Tom's dinner table, the cigarette case, the missing file, the anonymous report, the cufflink. They were all threads of the same web. And now Tom knew exactly who was at the center. Tom had gone over 100 plans in his head, each more reckless than the last. Before deciding on the only one that mattered, he had to see Sophie. Officially, he wasn't allowed near her. Not while the investigation into his guardianship was ongoing. But official rules had stopped matching the moment. He realized the man who destroyed her family was the same one who stood beside him all these years. It was nearly midnight when he parked 2 blocks from the trauma center and slipped through a side entrance Evelyn had quietly left unlocked. The halls were dark and silent, the sterile smell of disinfectant hanging in the air. Evelyn met him just outside Sophie's room. 5 minutes, she whispered. If they catch me doing this, I'll lose my license. Tom nodded once, gratitude and guilt warring in his chest. Then he stepped inside. Sophie was sitting by the window, legs tucked under her, her sketchbook open on her lap. The soft glow of the streetlights outside painted her face in pale gold. When she saw Tom, her eyes widened, then softened. She didn't speak, she never did, but she didn't turn away either. He knelt beside her chair, his voice barely above a whisper. Hey, kiddo, I missed you. For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain tapping against the glass. Then, so quiet, he almost missed it. Her lips moved. Shadow. Tom's heart stopped. It was the first word she had spoken in 10 years. One word, fragile and trembling, but enough to split the silence that had held her captive for so long. Yes, he said gently. The shadow. He's real, and I need your help to stop him. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, one taken over a decade ago. It showed Andrew Keaton smiling, stiffly beside a man with an easy grin and a hand on his shoulder. Patrick Doyle. Tom placed it on Sophie's lap. Do you remember him? He asked. Sophie stared at the photo for several seconds. Then, with slow, deliberate motion, she lifted her finger and pointed straight at Patrick. Tom closed his eyes. That was all the confirmation he needed. I need you to do one more thing, he said softly. Can you draw him? Not like a shadow. Draw the man you saw that night. Every detail you remember. Sophie hesitated, then picked up her pencil. Tom stayed with her in the quiet, watching the lines form under her hand. Bit by bit, a face emerged, angular, hard, distorted by rage. A diagonal scar slashed across one cheek. The eyes were wild, desperate. It was Patrick, unmistakably so. When she was done, Tom folded the page carefully and slipped it into a folder already holding the silver cufflink Peter Nichols had given him. It wasn't enough to put Patrick away yet, but together there were pieces of a puzzle that, once complete, could end this nightmare. The next morning, Tom walked into Captain Raymond Sykes' office and laid the folder on his desk. Sykes studied the evidence in silence, flipping through the photos, the sketch, the cufflink. This is thin, Sykes said finally. A defense attorney will rip it apart. I know, Tom admitted, but it's something. And if I can get him to talk, to slip up even once, that's all we'll need. Sykes exhaled heavily. I'll give you 24 hours. After that, if you don't bring me something solid, this case goes back in the drawer. 24 hours. That was all the time Tom had to end a 10-year hunt. That night, he sat at his kitchen table with the phone in his hand, staring at Patrick's number on the screen. His thumb hovered over the call button for a long time. Then he pressed it. Patrick, he said when the familiar voice answered. We need to talk. About the case. About everything. I think I'm ready to put this to rest. There was a pause, then Patrick's calm reply. Name the time and place. Tomorrow morning, Tom said. The old Braddock Brick Factory. See you then, Patrick said, and the line went dead. Tom stared at the phone. The silence in the room louder than any sound. It all went according to plan. By this time tomorrow, the shadow that had haunted Sophie's life would finally have a name and a face in the eyes of the law. The portrait was unlike anything Sophie had drawn before. It wasn't just a man's face. It was a confession on paper. The lines were harsh, carved deep into the page, the strokes jagged and deliberate. Patrick's features emerged in chilling detail. The diagonal scar slashed across his cheek. The sneer twisted into something almost animal, and the eyes, those hollow, furious eyes that seemed to stare straight through the paper. It was rage and fear and guilt, all bound together in graphite and ink. Tom stared at it for a long time in silence. This wasn't a memory anymore. It was evidence. It was truth. And tomorrow, that truth would confront the man who had built his life on lies. The old Braddock Brick Factory loomed like a relic from another world. Its red walls weathered and crumbling under a gray Pennsylvania sky. Tom arrived before dawn, the air damp and heavy with the promise of rain. He walked the perimeter twice, checking the entrances, memorizing the layout. Somewhere in the shadows, a tactical team waited, Sykes's people, armed and silent, ready to move on his signal. At exactly 9 a.m., a black SUV rolled up the gravel road. Tom's breath caught as Patrick stepped out, dressed casually, as if this were just another conversation between friends. He approached with the easy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. Tom, Patrick greeted, spreading his arms. 10 years, and you still chase ghosts. I thought we were past this. Tom didn't move. We're not past anything. Not until Sophie gets justice. Patrick chuckled, low and humorless. Justice? You mean vengeance. You're trying to fix what you couldn't solve. That's what this is about. It's about them, Tom snapped. Andrew, Laura, Daniel, and a 5-year-old girl who hid under a bed while you slaughtered her family. Something flickered in Patrick's eyes. Something cold and reptilian. Then he sighed and rubbed the scar on his cheek. I didn't mean for it to go that way, he said quietly. Andrew was going to talk. We built everything together, the accounts, the shell companies, and then he got cold feet. Said he was done. Said he'd turn himself in. Tom felt the words sink into his bones. So you killed him. I silenced a liability, Patrick corrected. Laura and the boy walked in. They saw too much. I couldn't leave witnesses. And Sophie, Tom demanded, his voice cracking. Patrick's expression shifted into something like amusement. I thought she was dead, curled under that bed, pale as a ghost. I figured it was fate, a sign that I was meant to walk free. And I did. Tom's hands trembled. But his voice was steady. Not anymore. He pulled the folded sheet from his jacket and handed it over. Patrick frowned and opened it and froze. The color drained from his face as he stared at Sophie's drawing, at the twisted face with the scar and the eyes that betrayed his soul. She remembers, Tom said softly. Every second, every detail. Patrick's hand drifted unconsciously to his cheek, fingertips brushing the scar. His breath quickened. No, he muttered. No, she was 5. She couldn't have. She did. Tom cut him off. And soon the world will know too. Panic flashed across Patrick's face. His gaze darted around the empty factory floor, searching for an exit. Then, in one desperate, irreversible motion, he drew a gun from inside his jacket and aimed it at Tom. You should have left it buried, he hissed. You should have walked away. But before he could pull the trigger, a voice rang out from the shadows. Drop the weapon. Figures emerged from the dark, tactical officers in body armor, rifles trained on Patrick. Sykes stepped into the light behind them, his badge glinting. It's over, Doyle. Don't make this worse. Patrick's composure shattered. He spun and bolted, the gun still in his hand. Stop him! Sykes shouted and chaos erupted. Tom chased him through the labyrinth of rusted stairwells and echoing hallways. Boots pounding on concrete. The factory was a maze of forgotten machinery and narrow passages. The air thick with dust and adrenaline. Patrick fired wildly over his shoulder. The shots ricocheting off steel beams. They burst onto the upper catwalk, the floor crumbling beneath their feet. Patrick stumbled, cornered now by the drop on one side and armed officers closing in on the other. He looked at Tom, chest heaving, eyes wild. It doesn't matter, he spat. They'll never convict me without a witness. You're wrong, Tom said, stepping closer. She is the witness. Patrick's eyes darted toward the railing. Slowly, he lifted the gun. Not toward Tom, but toward himself. Then I'll take that from you, too, he said hoarsely. They can't put a dead man on trial. Tom lunged forward and grabbed his wrist, just as his finger tightened on the trigger. The gun clattered to the floor and slid out of reach. They struggled briefly before Patrick collapsed to his knees, defeated. Tom stood over him, breathing hard. No, you don't get an escape, he said, his voice low and steady. You're going to live. You're going to wake up every day and remember what you did to Andrew, to his family, to Sophie. That's justice. Patrick stared at the ground, trembling as officers swarmed in to cuff him. For the first time in 10 years, the shadow that had haunted Sophie's life had a face, a name, and a future. One spent behind bars, where it belonged. The trial was everything Tom had imagined and dreaded all at once. It stretched on for weeks, an unrelenting procession of evidence, witnesses, and the chilling details of a crime that had haunted the city for a decade. Patrick Doyle sat at the defense table, his once easy confidence replaced by a hollow stare. Piece by piece, the truth unraveled. Sophie's drawings, the silver cufflink, the cigarette case, and finally, Patrick's own confession, captured during the desperate confrontation in the factory, sealed his fate. When the verdict came, the courtroom was silent. Guilty, the foreman said, his voice steady. On all counts. Patrick didn't speak, didn't look at Tom or Sophie. He simply stared straight ahead as the judge delivered the sentence. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It was over, but the trial's impact reached far beyond one man. Patrick's testimony, given in a final bid for leniency that never came, tore open an entire criminal network. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies exposed, and several high-profile arrests followed. For the first time in years, Tom felt the heavy shadow of the Keaton case begin to lift, not just from the city, but from his own shoulders. A week later, Chief Raymond Sykes called Tom into his office. The department wants you back, Sykes said. Full reinstatement. You've earned it. Tom stared at the badge on the table, the same one he'd carried through every crime scene, every interrogation, every sleepless night. It had been his identity for most of his life. But as he thought about the girl waiting at home, the girl who had whispered shadow for the first time in a decade, the decision was easy. I appreciate it, Tom said quietly, pushing the badge back across the table. But my most important job isn't behind a desk anymore. It's at home. Sykes nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. You're a hell of a detective, Tom, but you're an even better father. The days that followed were quieter, gentler. Sophie had returned home weeks before the verdict, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, something fundamental had shifted in her. Words came slowly at first, single syllables whispered late at night or scribbled on scraps of paper before she dared speak them aloud. Then phrases, then full sentences. One evening, Tom was washing dishes when he felt a light tug on his sleeve. He turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway with her sketchbook tucked under one arm. Dad, she said softly. The plate slipped from his hands and shattered in the sink, but he barely noticed. He crossed the room in 2 steps and wrapped his arms around her, his throat too tight for words. 10 years of silence, of fear and nightmares and shadows, and now a single word had shattered them all. Spring came slowly to Pittsburgh, the city thawing under pale sunlight. On one of those crisp afternoons, Tom and Sophie sat together on a weather-worn bench in Schenley Park, the same one they had visited countless times before. She had her sketchbook open again, pencil moving in calm, deliberate strokes. Tom watched quietly, letting the breeze carry away the remnants of winter's chill. When she turned the page toward him, he felt his chest tighten. The drawing was simple but beautiful. A house, warm and glowing against a soft night sky. Light spilled from every window, and smoke curled gently from the chimney. And this time, there were no shadows lurking in the corners, no darkness creeping along the edges. Just home. Tom looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the frightened 5-year-old he had pulled from beneath a bed all those years ago, but a young woman reclaiming her life one breath, one word, one drawing at a time. He reached over and took her hand. It's beautiful, he said. Sophie smiled, and for the first time in 10 long years, Tom felt the weight of the past finally lift. Justice, he realized, wasn't just what happened in a courtroom. It wasn't just a sentence or a verdict. Justice was this, a girl who had lived through darkness, learning to draw the light again. As the sun dipped below the Pittsburgh skyline, Tom squeezed her hand a little tighter. The case was closed. The shadow was gone. And sitting there beside Sophie, watching her sketch a future free of fear, he knew that they had both found what they'd been searching for all along.